Okay, today we're going to be going over election results, mostly in Washington State, and why they matter to you. Thank you for watching. My name is Glenn Morgan, and this is We the Govern. And as always, when we do these stories about Washington State, I have to remind everybody that we are under Governor Inslee's eternal emergency orders, which means we're basically at his whim and whatever changes and lockdown issues that he wants to have. So it's important to point out to everybody that nothing I say here has been approved by Inslee's Ministry of COVID Compliance. That being said, I don't plan to talk much about COVID. I want to go right into the elections and talk about how they matter to you and the rest of us who live in our communities. Right now, because we just had election 2021, it's an off-year election, and everybody's paying attention to what's going on in the national scene, most attention has been focused on Virginia, where we saw governor race go differently than how people had expected, which is the Republican Youngkin won over the anticipated winner, Terry McAuliffe, who was the Democrat choice and former governor in Virginia. So that's a big deal. That's monopolized in the news stories in an off-year election cycle. That's a big deal, and it tends to ripple around the rest of the country. And the other race that has gotten a lot of attention has been the New Jersey governor's race, which has been shockingly close. At the time that I'm actually filming this video, nobody has called this race yet. It's not clear who's won. And the very fact that in a governor race like this in New Jersey, where the Republican wasn't considered even an option to be considered for the race, to have it come down to the wire like this is pretty stunning and shocking, and I'm sure the political establishment is paying a lot of attention now to what's going on and the various issues that have led to a result like that. However, when I'm looking at these races around the country, I want to go back to Virginia because I'm kind of a big fan of Virginia's newest lieutenant governor, Winsome Sears. Beyond the fact that she has the coolest name of any politician on the ballot this cycle, the fact that she won so decisively in that state with a real interesting campaign that I think there's something to be learned from her race for particularly the Republican leadership and those who aspire to run for these types of offices in our state, in Washington. And I want to specifically point out the fact that she was not afraid to come out and be a very pro-Second Amendment person, pro-freedom person right from the beginning. And if you go back and look at some of her interviews, and I'm going to link to some of those down below, her communication style and method of explaining why she supported these freedom issues, why she thought they were important, how she talked about them, it was unapologetic and very straightforward and very clear as to who she was. And she doubled down on it. I mean, this practically looks like a movie poster. You know, if that was this was her campaign poster. And she totally took flack for it and was unapologetic about her support for the Second Amendment and how much she likes to go shooting. And I mean, she even doubled down and did her whole Take Back the Commonwealth RV tour in Virginia. This is not somebody who's afraid to actually stand up for what she believes in and promote it in her campaign literature and do something that's a little beyond what I think most people do. There's a message from this that I think local political leaders and leaders all over the country could learn from, particularly those who care about freedom and liberty, and that is that there's no reason not to be bold, to be fearless, to know what you believe, and to be able to defend your beliefs. She's very good at this. These interviews really show that, and it was very exciting to see her win. Of course, the national news focuses on her race, and that's interesting, but I think the most important thing is to see her fearlessness in defending freedom in her campaign. And so it's really fun to see somebody like Sears get into office in Virginia, and it'll be fun to watch and see where she goes from there. So let's go back to Washington State, though, which doesn't get a lot of national news when it comes to the election results, and let's see how those results reverberate throughout the state, at least as they stand right now. Now, one thing to remember about Washington results, I'm filming this literally the day after the election, so in our all mail-in ballot system that we have in this state, tons of ballots are still coming in for weeks. We don't know what the final results are going to be because of that, so all we can go off of is what the initial results were that were posted, and then we will watch over the next couple weeks to see how things change as election workers discover new batches of ballots in their car and in King County, and as the U.S. Post Office finally gets around to doing their job and delivering the ballots. One thing, though, that came out, the only 3 votes that were statewide were advisory votes on tax increases, and clearly based on the results so far, Washingtonians don't support any of these new taxes. In particular, there was strong rejection of advisory vote number 37, which was the capital gains income tax dressed up. It's really an income tax dressed up as a capital gains tax that was passed by the legislature barely, with only Democrats voting for it and Governor Inslee voting for it. What's interesting is that this significant rejection reduction of these taxes, once again, will probably lead to initiatives next year to repeal at least some of these taxes. And the voters are clearly indicating in advance that they're going to be willing to vote against these taxes. So we'll have to see how it goes. I mean, there's a clear message here. The voters of Washington State don't want to be losing more of their money into the bottomless pit and the disastrous spending habits of our state. And perhaps it might be partially due to the fact that Washington State has lost at least $1 billion in just fraud out of their unemployment program. So who knows what's actually going on with our money. The other big story, and this is a significant story for the whole state, because even if you don't live in Seattle, what happens in Seattle doesn't stay there. It spreads like a disease, and it's far more harmful than COVID or anything else, these socialist policies or just terrible public policy that comes out of Seattle. And really want to focus on the Seattle attorney race. And this is really a dramatic race. Earlier, there was a primary where the incumbent Pete Holmes, who was a terrible Seattle attorney, really a horrible person, terrible public policy guy, he got bounced out and squeezed out in the primary. And so there were essentially two candidates that were on the ballot. And these two candidates were Ann Davidson and Nicole Thomas Kennedy. Ann Davidson ended up prevailing as of election night by a substantial margin. And there was a big contrast between these two candidates because Ann Davidson, rare for Seattle, actually was affiliated with the Republican Party when she ran for lieutenant governor here just a few years ago, I mean, just recently. And so that race and the fact that she had identified herself as a Republican, normally that would just kill you in Seattle. But when she jumped into this race to run for Seattle City Attorney, she really had a clear message of trying to restore some type of law and order and just reasonable approaches to how they prosecute crimes in Seattle, which under the Pete Holmes administration just been abandoned. They were letting people, wholesale criminals could just commit crimes everywhere, and they rarely would prosecute. Releasing them early was part of the plan. It was a real fiasco and a mess, especially with CHOP and Chaz and all kinds of craziness going on in Seattle. And Nicole Thomas Kennedy, who lost this race, thank God for the people in Seattle, clearly just wanted it to get worse. I mean, this is a super pro-crime person, pro-Antifa, openly in favor of Antifa, wanted to put a camp for Antifa between Portland and Seattle, and celebrated CHOP, liked the riots, wanted to abolish the police department, attacked the police openly. It was a really amazing contrast. Rarely do you get such a clear contrast in Seattle. This contrast was dramatic, and Ann Davidson winning this race is a significant result. That is a big deal. That's likely to help Seattle keep from self-destructing. But that wasn't the only race that was really interesting to see in the city of Seattle. And one of them was actually the race for mayor. And there's no Republicans in this race. You clearly had two different Democrats. Bruce Harrell was an old-style lefty Democrat, for sure, running against Lorena Gonzalez, who was just totally crazy. And so you had this crazy socialist on one side and just your average left-leaning Democrat on the other side. And Bruce Harrell took the race very dramatically and very significantly, where he was able to get 64% of the vote as of election night. And that is a pretty decisive win, even at the King County Auditor's Office. I do not believe they're going to be able to find enough ballots tucked away in employees' trunks to be able to change the outcome of this race. So Bruce Harrell has definitely won the mayor's race in Seattle, and it's not like he's a Republican or he's pro-freedom or pro-liberty, but at least you had somebody that wasn't totally insane and wanted to destroy the city win, which would have been, it would have been disastrous if his opponent had won. And the other race that was kind of similar to this was Sarah Nelson versus Nikita Oliver. And Nikita Oliver, again, another crazy who really wanted to destroy Seattle's law and order, just any kind of semblance of safety in that city as best she could. Losing this race was a big deal. With 60% going to Nelson, clearly that's another race that I think it's pretty easy to call at this point in time. So these three races really resonate with the rest of Washington State in the sense that they indicate Seattle may not want to destroy itself. And after all, they may have gone kind of to the precipice. And so we still have to see how things go over the next couple of election cycles. But it's very possible we may be looking back on the 2021 election and saying, you know, that's the point where Seattle kind of had a tipping point where they decided maybe we don't want to burn our whole city down and destroy it. Maybe we actually want it to be restored to some semblance of what a city should be, where people actually want to come and visit and live and be somewhat safe when they go there. So that's kind of a big deal. There's a couple other races I want to focus on in the state that, although they're local races and you may not live there, they're interesting indicators, I think, of where some of these elections are going and why it kind of matters. Again, I always say these local races really matter because the people who run for these local offices around the state are ultimately the ones who are going to be running for higher office someday. Some percentage of them will. we get a chance when we elect them to these local offices, see how they do when they're in office at a local level, and that demonstrates whether or not there's somebody that we'd like to see at a higher level. And so there were a couple of interesting races. The city of Renton, it was great to see the city council race result. James Albertson, I'm a fan of this guy, actually. I've met him, talked to him before. He lost a race once, or a couple years ago when he ran for the city of Renton. It was kind of a heartbreaking loss, so it was great to see him run again. And I talked with him earlier this year before it was earlier this, about 6 months ago, I think now. And it was really fun to see this race and see it develop so much. This is a guy who cares about the safety of his community. He's pro-law enforcement. He's pro-reasonable approaches to managing a city, fiscal responsibility, all kinds of things, and that the socialist progressive left hates. And this guy is solid. I mean, it's exciting to see him run. I'm hoping that he has higher office aspirations, but first, I'm excited to see what he does in Renton. And if Renton can be influenced by a good guy like this get into office, then it's good to see that and see how that kind of ripples around the state, or at least in that area. And staying in King County, just right next door to the city of Renton, it's the city of Newcastle. That's where I grew up originally, long before there was a city of Newcastle, and people have paid attention to my stories in the past and know that my dad was involved in founding the city and had been on the city council back in the early 90s. But there was a very contentious race there recently, and Robert Clark won the city council seat. And this is really a significant thing because Robert's a very qualified guy running for office, caring about fiscal issues. The city of Newcastle has really dealt with some poor historic choices made by historic city councils there over the last 10 years or so, and it's really put them in a fiscal situation where they're trying to raise taxes when they shouldn't be, making up for just bad decisions in the past. And so it's good to see somebody like this getting on that council. He won't be alone. There's another council member there that's also fiscally responsible, and depending on how the other couple races end up when we get all these other ballots coming in, they may even have a majority of fiscal sanity on the city of Newcastle, which will be a good improvement over where it's been recently. That's just fun to see. City of Burien has been featured prominently at We the Governed. I've done some articles about Crystal Marks, who's best known. She likes to dress up and join Antifa on the streets of Seattle when they can have a little riot every now and then. I filed a number of PDC complaints against her for her campaign finance violations in the past. She's a prolific violator of those laws and really not a good person to have anywhere near any kind of public office at all. And the city of Burien was not well served by having her there. So it was good to see her lose her election, and newcomer, Maura, to this race. Maura's got about 56% of the vote as of election night. Maura was attacked extensively by the Stranger and other socialist groups for daring to challenge the chosen Marks incumbent, and it was good to see Stephanie Maura stick to her guns and basically run a good race and a solid campaign for the city of Burien. This is going to be very good for the people who live there. And again, what happens in Burien doesn't stay there, so it's good to see this kind of shift in an intelligent direction. A couple other races there that are worth watching, but some of the numbers are still too close to call. So just when looking around the state, a couple of these races just stood out, and I'm going to have another video that we'll be producing shortly. Should be launching very quickly, just about some other more detailed races around the state. And again, if you want to learn more, please go to wethegovern.com. I'll have some more detailed election reports there. It's a little bit easier to kind of cover a bigger area when you're doing something in writing. And also, don't forget to subscribe and share this video with others. This is a good example, this recent election, those who say that they don't want to participate in the election process because nothing, my guys don't win or it's all rigged or something like that. Listen, I'm aware of the problems, but if you don't vote, you don't count. And as I always say, the future belongs to those who show up.